Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters. I'm your host Mitch, glad to have you here. Now usually on this show we build fun and inexpensive focused commander decks on a $25 budget, but today we have an episode of Quests for Quarters. On episodes like these I'm going to take you through underrated budget cards that you should be considering when you build your decks. For these episodes, not only does every card have to be under $1, but they also have to be used in less than 4,000 decks on EDH Rec. In this show and episodes like this are possible because of viewers like you. So make sure that you like this episode, subscribe to the channel, and share it with friends. And while you're at it, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any episodes. You can also support this show directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without their support. Another way that you can support the show is by checking out our merchandise on thecommandersquarters.com. And finally, you can support this show by supporting our sponsor, TCG Player. So whenever you're buying a deck or just individual cards, make sure you use our links below. My first underrated Quest for Quarters card is Island Sanctuary. Currently it's just less than $1 and is seeing play in 1,300 decks. It says if you would draw a card during your draw step, instead you may skip that draw. If you do, until your next turn you can't be attacked except by creatures with flying and or island walk. This is a fantastic way to protect yourself from the majority of creatures. This can be even more effective at protecting yourself than a card like Ghostly Prison in many situations. There is definitely a drawback to this card, but in the right deck that drawback is very minimal. First off, skipping that draw is a May ability, so if you don't need to, you don't have to. You may have other ways to protect yourself, or there might not be a lot of threats on the board, so you don't have to skip that draw. And in a deck like Feldergriff, skipping one draw is no big deal at all. Because in a deck like that, you're going to get set up with draw engines as well as other ways to draw cards. The amount of protection that this card can grant you for just a minimal cost is invaluable. In comparison, Stormtide Leviathan is seeing play in 7,200 decks and costs 8 mana. Now this card does have its advantages and disadvantages compared to Island Sanctuary. One advantage is that you don't have to skip any draws. Another is that it's an 8/8 with Island Walk, so it's a pretty big threat. But being a creature is also a downside too, as it's much easier to remove. On top of that, it makes it so that creatures without flying or island walk can't attack at all. Island Sanctuary is definitely superior in this way because it only protects you and not your opponents. And again, only costing 2 mana instead of 8 is a huge advantage for Island Sanctuary. I'm not saying that Island Sanctuary belongs in every deck that it can because there's definitely a drawback, but there are far more than 1,300 decks that could easily deal with that drawback and could definitely use this card. I think it's even fair to say that there are more decks that could use Island Sanctuary than something like Stormtide Leviathan. I'm not saying it's not a powerful card, but 8 mana is a lot for anything. But perhaps the closer comparison would be Moat, which is only seeing play in less than 900 decks. Now the reason for that is very obvious, it's because the card is nearly $800. Moat definitely illustrates how powerful an effect like this is though. It simply says creatures without flying can't attack. So like Island Sanctuary, this is an enchantment, so it's harder for our opponents to deal with. On top of that, there's no downside of losing a draw. And this also doesn't allow creatures with Island Walk to attack either. But like Stormtide Leviathan, it protects everyone on the board instead of just yourself. I'm definitely not saying that Island Sanctuary is anywhere near as powerful as Moat is. There's a reason that Moat is nearly $800 and Island Sanctuary is less than $1. But having a way to constantly protect yourself is a very powerful effect in Commander. I think no cards illustrate this more than Ghostly Prison and its clone, Propaganda. Ghostly Prison is currently seeing play in 28,000 decks and is $5.68. And Propaganda has jumped to 29,000 decks and is nearly $10. Both are enchantments for 3 mana, and they say creatures can't attack you unless their controller pays 2 for each creature they control that's attacking you. These effects are quite powerful, and that's why they're seeing so much play. And they're definitely more effective than Island Sanctuary is against creatures with flying and island walk. But in certain scenarios, Island Sanctuary is just more effective. The later the game goes, the more access to mana people have, and the more willing they are to use it to attack. Island Sanctuary is by no means as good as either of these cards, but it's definitely a good card too. It does have a drawback, so it shouldn't be seeing play in 30,000 decks, but it should be seeing play in a lot more than 1,300. My next underrated Quest for Quarters card is Scoop Mob. Scoop Mob is currently seeing play in 2,100 decks and is only a quarter. It's a 1/1 insect for a green that says at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 5 or more lands, put 4+1/+1 counters on Scoop Mob. There are very few 1-drops out there that can become huge threats on their own. Once you have those 5 lands, in just a few turns, it can easily become the biggest threat on the board. And green decks especially want to ramp with lands, so you're going to get there sooner rather than later. If you have this in your opening hand, you can basically just put it on the battlefield and forget about it. Your opponents won't waste removal on it, and if you have to chump block with it, you can. If it sticks around though, it becomes a 5/5 and then a 9/9 and so on and so forth. The size of a threat that this can become for just 1 mana is absolutely absurd. As I mentioned before, there aren't too many 1 mana threats out there, but let's go through a couple of them. The first one is a fantastic early gameplay with Serra Ascendant. In Commander, it's essentially a 6/6 flyer with lifelink for only 1 mana. Now this card is obviously going to be better than Scoop Mob early in the game, but the later the game goes, Serra Ascendant can only get weaker and Scoop Mob can only get stronger. Once you drop below 30 life, Serra Ascendant becomes a 1/1. Once you have those 5 lands, Scoop Mob is just going to continue to grow and get bigger and bigger. It only takes 2 turns for Scoop Mob to get bigger than Serra Ascendant. Now I'm not going to claim that Scoop Mob is overall better than Serra Ascendant. A 6/6 flyer with lifelink for 1 mana is absurd. But by playing Serra Ascendant on turn 1, you put a huge target on your back. Whereas by playing Scoop Mob on turn 1 is absolutely no threat to your opponents. Again, there aren't really many 1-drops in Commander that can compare with Scoop Mob. But a somewhat comparable card is Primordial Hydra. It's currently over $7 and is seeing play in 5,000 decks. For X green and a green, it enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. At the beginning of your upkeep, you're going to double the number of +1/+1 counters on Primordial Hydra. And then it has Trample as long as it has 10 or more +1/+1 counters on it. So these cards can fill different roles but act somewhat the same. Both are going to get stronger on your upkeep on their own. Scoop Mob can definitely be played earlier and can get big quickly. If you play Primordial Hydra early, it's going to take more time for it to get big. But the Hydra can be a great mana sink, and it's definitely going to get bigger eventually. On top of that, once it gets big enough, it has Trample, which is a huge difference. It's definitely a card that benefits more the more that you invest into it. Scoop Mob may have a lower ceiling, but it also requires less investment. And since it's only 25 cents, Scoop Mob also requires less of a monetary investment too. Another card that illustrates the power of a creature that can grow on its own is Mana Gorger Hydra. For 3 mana, it starts off as a 1/1 with Trample, but it doesn't stay that way for long. It has whenever a player casts a spell, put a +1/+1 counter on it. It does cost 2 more than Scoop Mob, but it does have Trample and it can easily get bigger than Scoop Mob. A very similar card to this is Taurian Mauler, which has whenever an opponent casts a spell, you may put a +1/+1 counter on it. Now this doesn't take into account your spells, but it's still a very powerful effect. And since it has Changeling, it also fits in a lot of tribal decks too. And like Scoop Mob, it also doesn't have Trample, but it's seeing play in more than twice as many decks. In Commander, there are many decks that definitely have a need for these kinds of creatures though. These creatures can easily become the biggest threats on the board and you have to invest very little into them. And especially with all the decks that revolve around +1/+1 counters, Scoop Mob should be seeing much more play. For just 25 cents, it's an absolute steal. Our next underrated Quest for Quarters card is Gate to the Afterlife. Currently it's only 17 cents and it's seeing play in just over 600 decks. It's an artifact that costs 3 and it says whenever a non-token creature you control dies, you gain 1 life. Then you may draw a card. If you do, discard a card. You can also pay 2 and tap it to sacrifice it to search your graveyard, hand, and or library for a card named God Pharaoh's Gift and put it onto the battlefield. If you search your library this way, shuffle it. Activate this ability only if there are 6 or more creature cards in your graveyard. Personally, I think you can just ignore that second ability and the first part of the card is amazing. Ironically enough, I think that without that text, it would actually see more play. I think a lot of people might just see that giant wall of text and ignore the card completely. Or they might think that they have to include God's Pharaoh Gift to actually make this card good. That simply isn't the case, and Gate to the Afterlife is an extremely undervalued card. It may not provide you with card advantage, but it does provide you with card selection. And on top of that, it gains you life in the process. There are plenty of aristocrat-style decks out there that aren't running this card and really should be. Currently, it's only seeing play in just 20% of Teysa Karlov decks, whereas a card like Grim Haruspex is seeing play in 93%. Now, unlike Gate to the Afterlife, Grim Haruspex is providing with card advantage, but since it's a creature, it's much more easy to remove it. Gate to the Afterlife might still only loot for you, but that's still very effective in these types of decks. And that life gain definitely shouldn't be discounted either. You can gain a ton of life with this in play. It can be especially effective at countering the effects of a card like Midnight Reaper. Midnight Reaper does draw you cards, but it's also going to deal damage to you too. Now the card advantage is definitely worth the damage, and that's why it's already seeing play in 1,600 decks. I'm definitely not saying that Gate to the Afterlife is better than either of these cards. What I am trying to say though is that for the most part, all 3 of these cards belong in the same decks. Now let's take a look at Harvester of Souls, which is seeing play in over 12,000 decks. Unlike the previous cards, it also takes into account whenever your opponent's non-token creatures die too. But the price for this is an extra 3 mana, which might not be worth it. In my opinion, I definitely prefer Gate to the Afterlife over Harvester of Souls for most decks. Again, not every single deck is going to want this type of effect, but decks that do usually have a low curve. And as I mentioned before, Gate to the Afterlife is just more durable since it's an artifact instead of a creature. At just 17 cents, this is a fantastic budget card and should be seeing play in a lot more decks than it is. But now let's move on to our final underrated Quest for Quarters card, which is Scourge of Fleets. Currently it's only 28 cents and is seeing play in just under 4,000 decks. It's a 6/6 Kraken for 7 mana, and when it enters the battlefield, return each creature your opponents control with toughness X or less to its owner's hand, where X is the number of islands you control. This card is a one-sided board wipe on a body. There are very few cards out there that can bounce your opponent's creatures without bouncing your own. This is an extremely powerful card in a mono blue deck. In blue, there are plenty of ways to abuse this trigger by getting it back to your hand or flickering it, or other ways too. Now it does cost 7 mana, but most of the time you're going to want this effect later in the game anyways. This not only sets your opponents back, but it can also set you up to kill them on that turn. A somewhat similar card is the notorious Cyclonic Rift. Currently it's around $20 and is seeing play in over 87,000 decks. Now there's definitely no arguing which card is better. Cyclonic Rift is at instant speed and it gets all non-land permanents, but it really illustrates how powerful a one-sided board wipe can be. Even a card like Evacuation, which isn't one-sided, is seeing play in 12,000 decks. Now again, this definitely has the advantage of being at instant speed, and Scourge of Fleets is more limited on what kinds of decks it can be in because it does depend on those islands. But again, this just shows how powerful bouncing all creatures is. 7 mana might seem like a lot, but it is a one-sided effect. For comparison, you can see that people are still playing In Garruk's Wake even though it's 9 mana. Now, In Garruk's Wake does destroy the creatures, but bouncing them is still a very powerful effect. And as I mentioned before, since Scourge of Fleets is a creature, you can abuse that enter the battlefield trigger. There are very few creatures out there that have a one-sided board wipe attached to them. Even at 10 mana, a card like Dread Cacodemon is still seeing play. In my opinion though, 7 mana is a lot more reasonable than 10. 7 mana is the highest that many decks will go. So 10 mana can be pretty much out of the question. And that's why Dread Cacodemon isn't seeing play in nearly as many decks. But Scourge of Fleets definitely deserves to see more play than it is. And at just 28 cents, it's an absolute steal for the effect that it has. And with that, this show is coming to a close, but I really just want to hear about what you guys think about this episode, so why don't you let me know in the comments below. When you're buying a deck or just individual cards, make sure to use our link in the description. Not only will you be getting great prices on TCG Player, but you're also going to be supporting this show because they sponsor us. And make sure that you follow us on social media so you can get some early hints on who the next commander just might be. Links to our social media accounts can be found in the description. Also in the description below is a link to the Commander's Quarters Patreon page, and I just want to say a quick thank you to the patrons who have subscribed so far. There are many benefits to being a patron for the Commander's Quarters, including being able to vote on future commanders for deck techs. There's even a general level tier where you get your own personalized deck tech dedicated to you. I truly couldn't do this without all of your support, so from the bottom of my heart, thank you. If you haven't already, make sure that you like and subscribe to the channel. And while you're at it, check out some of our other episodes on budget deck techs, Quest for Quarters episodes, Commander topics, and Creators Quarters. And with that, I'm out of here. Thanks again, and have a good one.